Hello, and welcome to Markets in Focus. My name is Joe Bell, and today I'm going to walk you through some of the most interesting financial market themes that I'm observing. Very action-packed week. We had strong momentum, we had earnings, we had the Fed, we had Trump, we had a trade deal. We'll talk through the earnings. A strong Q1, but we did receive revisions lowered for Q2, a pretty significant amount. The Fed voices some concerns at their Fed meeting, even though they left rates alone, but that was quickly followed by an announcement by President Trump about a trade agreement between the US and UK. And then bearish sentiment. We've seen some pretty historic extremes in bearish sentiment over the past few weeks. It is coming down a little bit, but a streak of elevated bearish sentiment has reached a pretty historic measure. Now, this chart takes a look at the change in S&P 500 quarterly earnings per share during the first month of the quarter. So far in April, what did we see in terms of expectations for Q2? And you can see it was down 2.4%. This has been the fourth consecutive quarter, and this has actually been a pattern during the past few years. But what's interesting is in Q1, the S&P 500 had an earnings growth rate of year-over-year of 12.8%. That was the seventh consecutive quarter of year-over-year earnings increases. We did have 87 companies out of the S&P 500 issue negative earnings guidance for Q2. That's a little bit of the driver for what we see in the chart on the bottom right that I was just talking about. That surpassed a previous record, which actually just happened last quarter. So there has been a lot of negative guidance from companies. So far, they've been able to withstand this tariff issue, much of it because they were able to front load imports and perhaps insulate them from this. But the sooner we can get some of those agreements, perhaps we'll see whether earnings can surpass those lowered expectations next quarter. Now, midweek, the Federal Reserve also had their two-day meeting and they ended it with an announcement. It was not a shock. Everybody expected this rather, and that was that the Fed was going to keep the Fed funds target rate between 4.25 and 4.5%. You can see on the chart, this is the chart of the upper limit of that US Fed funds target rate range, currently at 4.5%. And then you can see those dots as are essentially the US Fed's median dot plot or their projections going forward. And at their latest meeting back in March, where they issued those summary of economic projections, they do those only once every quarter. We'll get their next one in June. They basically anticipated about two cuts. The market's not too far off there. If you look at Fed fund futures, they're expecting between 2 to 3 cuts. Powell did voice some concerns, something he started to issue comments about a couple weeks ago, basically saying tariffs create uncertainty for the economy. They could enter a scenario where inflation has upward pressure and we see downward pressure on economic growth, but they're going to remain data dependent. Not a lot of news there other than that they're going to remain patient given the uncertainty in the economy. Now, obviously, Trump doesn't like that. He's been a little bit negative toward Powell during the past several weeks. And a day after that announcement, Trump was able to reach an agreement and announced it in a joint call from the White House that the US and UK have reached a trade agreement on tariffs and non-tariff related trade items. This is the first officially announced trade agreement since the US began trade negotiations with pretty much every country around the world after that April 2nd significant tariff increase by the US. So this is the first deal of this negotiation period. So far, the markets initially reacted somewhat positively yesterday. We saw a little bit of profit taking today, up somewhat, a little bit. So somewhat of a positive reaction, but nothing very significant because we are on the heels of that massive rally off of that low where the market was up. The S&P 500 was up 9 consecutive days in a row, which was pretty historic. So there's been a lot of this already baked into the market expectations that we're going to start to see some of these trade deals, but nevertheless, the market was somewhat satisfied, not surprised. So in terms of bearish sentiment, we've talked about this over the past month or so. We have seen a lot of bearish sentiment, whether it's from earnings and guidance or sentiment polls. This is the American Association of Individual Investors. Every week they ask investors, are you bullish, bearish, or neutral on the stock market over the next 6 months? And we view this from a contrarian point of view. So when there's a lot of pessimism, that means maybe the markets are forming a bottom or there's not as much downside. And there's some pretty interesting stats. We reached above 60%. That's only happened a handful of times. It's back down below that threshold. but this bearish sentiment indicator has been above the 50%. So more than half of respondents have answered bearish for 11 consecutive weeks. And since this poll started back in 1987, they're still polling about north of 150,000 members. This is the longest streak we've ever seen. So there's no doubt that tariffs and the uncertainty around that are creating a lot of fear, a lot of sentiment, in some cases, rightfully so. But historically, when you see this amount of bearish pessimism, it means potentially, not guaranteed, but potentially there's less downside because there is so much negativity and fear already baked into the market. Now, finally, we're going back to the moon. It's happening. It's been 50 years. I haven't seen it in my lifetime. So the US is planning to send the first astronaut back to the moon for the first time in over 50 years. And if you remember a couple years ago, we were able to take some dirt, some lunar dirt from the moon back to the Earth and plant some plants and successfully do that. That has led to the planning of what they're calling NASA's LEAF experiment, launching with Artemis 3 spaceship in September 2026 to basically bring a mini greenhouse to the moon to test whether we can plant growth in lunar conditions. Pretty exciting news. It will be interesting to see if it's successful, but we'll finally get to see somebody go to the moon, something I have not seen in my lifetime. So that will be exciting. All right. With that, I want to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.